VASLELINE-GATE. Okay, so this one still gets brought up every time someone calls GSP the GOAT. We're talking UFC 94, January 2009, Georges St. Pierre versus BJ Penn 2. A welterweight super fight promoted like a boxing mega event. Champion versus champion, hype off the charts. GSP came in looking shredded and laser focused. BJ, as confident as ever. No one was thinking controversy, but by the end of round 2, Penn's corner started raising hell. They claimed GSP was slippery, not like metaphorical slippery, like literally covered in Vaseline. Replay shows one of St. Pierre's cornermen casually swiping petroleum jelly from his face, and then rubbing it on his back and shoulders. And if you've ever touched Vaseline, you know what that means. It's like trying to grapple a wet seal, which is a big problem when your whole strategy is jiu-jitsu. BJ's corner went ballistic between rounds. Cameras caught it. Dana White had a full meltdown octagon side. The Nevada State Athletic Commission had to step in during the fight and wipe down GSP between rounds 3 and 4 live mid-broadcasts. Now, was it intentional cheating? Nobody knows. Maybe it was a dumb mistake. Maybe they thought it's a cold night, rub him down. Either way, it looked shady as hell. BJ Penn would go on to lose by corner stoppage. Exhausted, flattened, and furious. And the fallout. First, the UFC and state commissions banned cornermen from applying Vaseline altogether. Second, they started using independent cutmen only. License, neutral, and under commission control. Third, this became Exhibit A. Anytime someone wanted to discredit GSP's legacy, even though he passed every drug test in his career, it's still debated over a decade later. Joe Rogan's talked about it, BJ still brings it up, and VASLELINE-GATE lives on, because it's the kind of rule change that came from just enough grease to slip through the cracks of a super fight. KHABIB'S cage, RIOT. There are post-fight brawls, and then there's UFC 229, October 6, 2018. Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor, the biggest pay-per-view in UFC history. The build-up? Toxic. The press tour? Basically a cold war with microphones. Conor threw a dolly through a bus window. Khabib didn't forget. Fast forward to the fight. Khabib dominates. 4 rounds of suffocation. Finally, submission. It's over. But the fight wasn't. Seconds after the tap, Khabib launches himself over the cage, diving straight into Conor's team. Like a flying bear in a papaka hat, he ignites a full-blown melee. Punches, kicks, water bottles, pandemonium. He vaulted over the fence directly at Dylan Dennis, McGregor's BJJ coach, whom he'd singled out during the fight. Dennis had been taunting Khabib earlier, and Khabib went straight for him. As this outside melee ignited, McGregor and Khabib's cousin Abubakar Nurmagomedov clashed on the top of the cage. McGregor landed a punch on Abubakar, causing a cut under his eye. Inside the cage, 2 of Khabib's teammates, Zubaira Tukhugov and Asid Emiragayev, joined, throwing hands at McGregor. And all of it? On the biggest stage the sport had ever seen. The broadcast muted itself. Buffer tried to re-announce the winner in front of a crowd that couldn't hear him. And the commission? They were fuming. There was talk of stripping titles, pulling licenses, canceling checks. Khabib's check was withheld. Multiple team members were suspended. Fines rained down. But the real fallout came in the form of rule changes.
I know my father gonna smash me when I go home because I know he's gonna smash me.
First, fighters were banned from jumping the cage post-fight unless authorized. Automatic fines, potential suspensions. Second, the UFC ramped up post-fight security with trained personnel surrounding the cage before the final bell even hits. Third, high-profile main events adopted neutral zone extractions. Champs are escorted out separately like world leaders leaving a summit. The image of Khabib leaping into the crowd is burned into MMA history. Iconic, unhinged, and completely unforgettable. Weight cutting reform. Weight cutting is probably the dumbest and most dangerous tradition still happening in combat sports today. And yeah, it's still legal. Every fighter does it. Strip out all the nuance and it's just dehydrate yourself to hell and back, step on a scale, then immediately try to gain it all back in 24 hours. But in late 2015, it finally caught up to the sport in 2 terrifying ways. First up, UFC 192, Grasso. She's in the back before weigh-ins, looks pale, weak, clearly drained. Moments later, she collapses. Full body failure. Her kidneys are screaming. Emergency crew gets called in. She's hospitalized for renal distress and nearly goes into shock. UFC pulls her from the card. She survives, barely, and tells reporters later that she thought she could just push through it. That almost cost her everything. Now take that and crank it up, because a few months later, in one championship, 21-year-old Yang Jianbing doesn't make it. Flyweight fighter, normal kid, drops too much weight too fast, has a cardiac arrest, dies from a weight cut. And that was it. The moment where promotions could no longer pretend this was just part of the job. And the changes came hard and fast. In the UFC, they scrapped same-day weigh-ins, moved them to 24 hours out, and brought in hydration tests using specific gravity measurements, basically testing the thickness of your pee to see if you're still functioning. They also encouraged fighters to compete closer to their walk-around weight. Though, let's be honest, that part's mostly ignored. But in one championship, things went nuclear. They overhauled the whole process. No more extreme cuts. Hydration testing before and during fight week. Fighters now weigh in multiple times and have to stay hydrated to be cleared. The idea was to make fighters compete at their real functional weight, and it mostly worked, sort of, because even today some fighters still show up shredded, still use sauna hoops, still find ways to fudge the numbers. But the death of Yang Jianbing forced the industry to admit the truth. Making weight was literally killing people. No more Speedos. Alright, let's talk about the time a grown man wore a tiny blue Speedo in front of a global audience and got banned for it. So it's UFC 133 2011. We've got veteran fighter Dennis Hallman squaring off against Brian Ebersol, and Hallman decides that this is the perfect moment to settle a bet he made with his teammates by walking out in the tiniest pair of blue briefs ever worn in a sanctioned MMA fight. And we're not talking compression shorts. We're talking straight up banana hammock, somewhere between a swimsuit and a cry for help. The fight starts, and right away, Ebersol is clearly distracted. Hallman's junk is everywhere. There's a full-blown wardrobe crisis happening in the octagon. Commentators are joking, the crowd is laughing, and Dana White is furious. He reportedly said it was, quote, disgusting, and no one would ever fight in the UFC again looking like that. To make things worse, Hallman loses the fight by TKO, and while Dana claimed his release wasn't related to the outfit, let's just say fighters usually don't get cut after one loss if they're veterans with name value. From that day forward, the UFC updated its dress code. Fighters were banned from wearing Speedo-style trunks or anything that might accidentally flash the audience. Fight kits became more standardized, first with sponsors and later through the Reebok and Venom deals. And now, if you type Dennis Hallman into Google, the top auto suggestions are still Speedo and shorts. So yeah, the legend lives on, just not in the cage. Groin shot crackdown. Back in the no-holds-barred era, groin shots were totally legal. Like, you could just openly soccer kick someone's family jewels and the ref would let it ride. And of course, someone eventually did it. Enter UFC 4, 1994, Keith Hackney versus Joe Sun, who, by the way, would later be convicted of some truly horrible crimes. But that's not what he's remembered for in the octagon. During their fight, Joe Sun has Hackney in a headlock from the bottom, and Hackney, looking around like, is this really legal?, just starts hammering him in the nuts, over and over and over. 15 shots, no exaggeration. Joe Sun eventually taps out from a testicular beatdown, and that wasn't even the worst one. Fast forward to IVC 1 in 1997. That's the International Vale Tudo Championship in Brazil, where Gary Goodridge took things to the next level. His opponent, Pedro Octavio, ends up underneath him, and Goodridge starts digging his toes inside the guy's trunks, using them for grip, like rock climbing. But gross. And then grabs a handful, a literal handful of his opponent's junk to control the position. The ref doesn't stop it. The crowd doesn't even flinch. And yes, Goodridge wins the fight. So between UFC and IVC, fighters were treating groins like legal targets. And unsurprisingly, it got banned. The UFC outlawed groin strikes officially in 1997, a few months after the IVC changed their rules. Digging into your opponent's trunks became a punishable offense, which again, why was that ever allowed? Now every fighter wears a protective cup, and refs always say protect yourself at all times, which in this context is just good advice. The point is, if your game plan used to involve nut shots, those days are over. COVID bubble protocols. This is the story of how a global pandemic turned the UFC into a sci-fi movie. It's March 2020. The world shuts down. Every major sport, NBA, NHL, even the freaking Olympics, hits pause. But Dana White? Nope. Dana says, we're doing this thing. And that thing became UFC 249, originally set for April with Khabib versus. Tony, it gets postponed like 5 times. Locations change. Cards fall apart. Finally, they land in Jacksonville, Florida in May 2020 with no crowd, no media, and a whole lot of tension. But then it happens. On the day of the weigh-ins, Ronaldo Jacare Souza tests positive for COVID-19. After showing up to the venue, doing media, face-offs, the whole deal. 2 of his cornermen test positive too. He's immediately pulled from the card, but everyone freaks out, and now the UFC's playing defense. Suddenly, Fight Island isn't just a meme, it's real. UFC scrambles to secure Yas Island in Abu Dhabi, turning it into a full-blown quarantine zone with daily testing, military-style transport, and hazmat protocols. Every fighter, coach, ref, and production member goes through a triple test system before departure on arrival. Fight day morning, no pass, no fight. Everyone gets isolated in hotel rooms for 24 to 48 hours until results come back. The Apex facility in Las Vegas becomes the US version of the bubble. Crowdless fights, remote commentary, and sterile walkouts become the norm, and despite the chaos, UFC becomes the first major sport back on TV. ESPN eats it up. The rest of the sports world watches closely. Were there bumps? Absolutely. Were fighters removed mid-fight week? Yup. But the blueprint worked. The introduction of TKOs. Alright, so this one's about something that seems super normal now. Referee stoppages, but at the time, they weren't even allowed. Like, literally, a ref couldn't stop a fight unless someone was unconscious or tapped out. So if you were getting your face rearranged but still technically awake, too bad. Keep going. This brings us to UFC 2, where things got ugly real quick. Pat Smith gets mount on Scott Morris and just starts raining down elbows. No defense, no escape. Morris is just eating shots, and the ref can't stop it. All he can do is watch. Smith finally gets up on his own, probably out of sheer boredom. Now imagine being Big John McCarthy standing there as a ref, watching this happen and knowing you have no power to protect the fighter. So after the event, Big John tells Rorion Gracie, who basically ran the UFC at that point, that if something doesn't change, he's out. And to be fair, Rorion was never a big fan of ref stoppages anyway. He believed the fight should only end in total defeat, unconsciousness, or submission, but Big John wins the argument. Starting at UFC 3, referees were officially allowed to stop fights if a fighter couldn't intelligently defend themselves, aka TKO by referee stoppage becomes a thing. That moment where the ref steps in and waves it off, yeah, it didn't exist before this. And honestly, it's wild to think how long it took for that to be a rule, because before that, getting beat senseless didn't mean the fight was over, it just meant you were still technically breathing. So yeah, if you've ever been grateful the ref saved someone from unnecessary brain damage, you've got Pat Smith, Scott Morris, and Big John McCarthy to thank for that. 12-6 elbows. So this one's easily the most controversial rule in all of MMA, and it's all thanks to a 6'10" giant smashing a smaller dude with elbows from the top rope. The rule? No 12-6 elbows. That's a straight downward strike. Picture the hands of a clock going from noon to 6. Illegal. Always has been under the unified rules. But ask any fighter, coach, or fan, and they'll probably say the same thing. Why? Okay, let's go back. IFC Battleground 2, year 2000. Not a UFC event, but still incredibly influential. Gan McGee, a literal skyscraper of a man, is facing Brad Gabriel, who's not skyscraper sized. McGee gets on top and just starts raining these straight vertical elbow drops, one after another, down on Gabriel's head and neck. Total mismatch. Brutal finish. Watching cage side, Dr. Dom Coletta, one of the ringside physicians for the New Jersey State Athletic Control Board, the same people helping draft the unified rules of MMA later that year. And after seeing McGee basically reenact a Mortal Kombat fatality with his elbows, Coletta's immediate reaction is, ban that. Initially, he wanted to ban elbows altogether, but Big John McCarthy, who was also helping draft the rules, pushed back. Elbows are essential to the sport. You can't get rid of all of them, so they landed on a compromise. Ban only the vertical, straight down elbow, the 12-6 motion. Everything else, diagonal, spinning, from the side, totally fine. Why that specific angle? According to Big John on Joe Rogan's podcast, it's because state officials had seen karate demos where guys broke blocks of ice with vertical elbows. No, seriously, ice breaking. That was the logic. And to this day, 12-6 is still illegal, even though pretty much everyone agrees it makes no sense. You can slam someone's skull with a spinning elbow, but God forbid you drop one straight down from mount. And yes, John Jones's only career loss came from this exact rule, so you know he loves it.